Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. Prisoners and guards take a break from work in Atlanta in 1895. The scene reflects a period when the American penitentiary system still relied on forced labor, especially of black men, through the so-called convict leasing. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, many southern states in the United States created laws that criminalized minor offenses in order to imprison formerly enslaved people and lease them to farmers and companies. Thus, compulsory labor persisted, disguised under the legal form of criminal punishment. Prisoners from a forced labor camp work at a well in Macon, Georgia, around 1900. This image depicts a penal system that exploited convict leasing, in which inmates, mostly black men, were forced to perform hard labor in mines, plantations, and public works. Even after the abolition of slavery in 1865, discriminatory laws and arbitrary imprisonments kept many formerly enslaved people under conditions of servitude and extreme exploitation. In Bartow County, state prisoners rest in narrow dormitories after a day of arduous forced labor. In the early 20th century, this type of incarceration was part of a penal system that exploited inmates, largely African Americans, in public works, fields, and railroads. Even decades after the abolition of slavery, many were convicted of minimal offenses and forced to work in degrading conditions, perpetuating servitude under another legal form. At night, the prisoners slept in overcrowded, unventilated quarters watched by guards and dogs. An unidentified black man appears chained to a pickaxe, a cruel symbol of the punishment imposed on prisoners during the 1930s. This type of punishment, used to humiliate and subjugate, reflects the racist practices that persisted in prisons in the southern United States. Chains and work instruments became tools of torture and control, expressing the continuity of the injustices of slavery under the guise of modern criminal law. Chains, shackles, and forced postures were common. Any act of insubordination was punished with isolation, starvation, or beating. In 1903, child prisoners work under the sun in agricultural fields, many of them African American. The juvenile penal system reproduced the logic of slave labor. It transformed punishment into profit. The small hands that should have held books and toys wielded hoes and shovels. Forced to harvest and carry produce, they lived deprived of childhood, education, and freedom. This child exploitation was part of the penal contract labor system, which profited from the labor of vulnerable minors. Their small, exhausted, barefoot figures reflect the persistence of racial inequality and the dark legacy of slavery in the early 20th century. Prisoners work on street construction in Birmingham in 1909, during the height of the city's industrialization. The forced labor of black men was widely used by private companies and local governments to pave roads, build bridges, and sustain urban growth. Under armed surveillance, these men faced extreme heat, severe punishments, and long shifts. The system profited from their exploitation, perpetuating structural racism in the economy of the southern United States. The inmates were loaned to private companies and city halls, which profited from unpaid labor. These prisoners were transported in a wooden wagon designed exclusively to take convicts, mostly African Americans, to sites of forced labor. Crushed into stifling compartments, they were taken to farms, quarries, and railroads. Many did not survive the brutal working conditions and inhuman treatment. The transport is precarious, suffocating, and serves both as displacement and as punishment. For many, it is the beginning of a one-way journey. This transport highlights the industrial scale of the penal system that transformed punishment into profit, keeping the slaveholding logic alive under new laws. A rare photograph discovered in the attic of a house in North Carolina reveals two enslaved children, sold in 1854 for $1,150. Found during a moving sale in Charlotte in 2010, the image is a painful testimony to the brutality of the human trade in the United States. The children's expressions, marked by resignation, reflect the trauma of family separation and the commodification of black life, reduced to figures and deeds of ownership. The gaze of the children is a silence that crosses time. It is the mirror of millions who were born without the right to childhood, family, or future. Around 1928, anti-slavery activists gather in Hull City to discuss the challenges of racial equality and the persistence of human exploitation. Even decades after legal abolition, the abolitionist movement kept the struggle against colonialism and global racism alive. Gathered in modest rooms, these militants shared reports, pamphlets, and testimonies of abuses, defending freedom as a universal right and denouncing new forms of economic servitude. The industrialized world still exploited colonies, forced the labor of Africans and Asians, and sustained European consumption with foreign sweat. Sir Thomas Buxton, vice president of the Anti-Slavery Society between 1895 and 1899, became a central figure in the struggle for abolition. Inheriting the legacy of his forebear, the parliamentarian Thomas Fowell Buxton, he dedicated his life to fighting human trafficking and promoting civil rights for people of African descent. Working through international conferences and public campaigns, Buxton helped consolidate the United Kingdom as a hub of moral resistance against modern slavery and imperialism. His activism articulated faith, morality, and politics, a rare balance between compassion and pragmatism. For him, abolition was not merely a legal act, but a continuous moral process. Oloda Equiano was one of the first black men to turn his pain into words and his biography into a political weapon. Born in West Africa and kidnapped as a child, he survived the horror of the slave ship and was sold in the British colonies. After buying his freedom, he became a sailor, a trader, and finally, a writer. In 1789, he published his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oloda Equiano, a work that shocked Victorian England by exposing the horror of the traffic and the humanity of the enslaved. His words crossed borders, fueling the debate that would lead to the abolition of the trade in the British Empire. In Georgia in 1850, an enslaved African-American family works under the relentless sun on cotton plantations. Men, women, and children repeat the mechanical gesture of picking, cleaning, and piling. Every movement is watched, every pause punished. Cotton, a symbol of wealth and elegance in the salons of the North and of Europe, is born here in sweat and exhaustion. At night after work, these families gather in simple cabins to sing, pray, and tell stories. It is there, far from the master's eyes, that they resist and keep the flame of humanity alive. Between 1860 and 1900, enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and their descendants work in vast cotton fields in South Carolina. Even after abolition, the economy of the southern United States continued to depend on black labor, now exploited through unfair contracts and unpayable debts. The plantations, direct heirs of the slave regime, used the system of tenancy and partnership, sharecropping, which kept workers eternally indebted to landowners. Cotton, a symbol of luxury and progress in international markets, hid the weight of arduous, poorly paid labor. In 1938, African-American children work on farms in southeastern Missouri. The photographic record reveals the direct heritage of the slave system, a stolen childhood transformed into a workforce. Small and barefoot, these children picked cotton and corn under a scorching sun, contributing to the survival of families trapped in misery. Many did not attend school, and education became a distant privilege. Rural child labor, tolerated and even encouraged, perpetuated deep social and racial inequalities. In Zanzibar during the 19th century, enslaved people in chains are watched by a soldier. The island, an important commercial port in the Indian Ocean, was one of the main centers of the African slave trade. Thousands of men, women, and children were captured in the interior of the continent and taken on long marches to the coast, where they were sold in open markets. Even after the official end of slavery decreed in 1897 under British pressure, the illegal trade continued for decades. Zanzibar's maritime routes supplied plantations, armies, and households in Arab and European colonies. Around 1930, forced labor was still a reality in several regions of Africa, including Liberia. The country, founded by freed African Americans, lived with the contradiction of reproducing colonial practices in its own territory. Indigenous and migrant workers were subjected to exhausting shifts, especially in freight transport and road construction. Reports from the time denounced physical punishment, lack of payment, and the use of coercion by local authorities and foreign companies. Chinese women who were victims of child slavery in the 19th century represent one of the lesser-known faces of global trafficking. Thousands were taken by force from rural regions of China to European colonies and countries in the Americas under false promises of work and marriage. On plantations, in mines, and in brothels, they were subjected to degrading conditions with no right of return. This exploitation crossed racial and cultural borders, turning women and children into international commodities. The victims lived between servitude and erasure, but their memory survives in rare records and the accounts of missionaries and abolitionists. Tony Thompson was born enslaved in Greene County, Georgia, in the early 19th century. The son of captive parents, he grew up on a cotton plantation, knowing from early on the weight of labor and the sound of the whip. After abolition, he tried to rebuild his life in a country that still saw black men as inferior. He worked as a farmer and a carpenter, raising a family and fighting to secure education for his children. He faced the racism of the Jim Crow laws, segregation, and the poverty that imprisoned generations. His trajectory, recorded in oral accounts, symbolizes the quiet resistance of millions of formerly enslaved people who, even without land or resources, built entire communities. Enslaved people work on a coffee plantation in São Paulo around 1882. Coffee was the great engine of the Brazilian 19th century economy, responsible for turning the country into one of the world's largest exporters. But behind the prosperity of the coffee barons and the grandeur of the estates was the brutal labor of enslaved men and women. Under the scorching sun, they faced shifts of up to 16 hours, enduring heat, exhaustion, and the whip. The slave quarters, often unhealthy, housed dozens of people in precarious conditions. The coffee cycle consolidated a powerful agrarian elite that resisted abolition for fear of losing its economic power. Henry Brooks was born enslaved in the southern United States in the mid-19th century. He grew up knowing the weight of chains and the rhythm imposed by the whip. During his youth, he saw the country plunge into the Civil War and witnessed the fall of the system that imprisoned him. After winning his freedom, he faced a new kind of prison: poverty, racism, and segregationist laws. He worked as a farmhand and a laborer, living the contradictions of a country that promised freedom but denied equality. His trajectory represents that of millions of freed African Americans who tried to rebuild life with dignity amid hostility and exclusion. Isaac and Rosa, enslaved children from New Orleans, were photographed in 1863 during the American Civil War. Their childlike faces, wearing simple clothes and serious looks, were used in abolitionist campaigns to sensitize the Northern public. The image ran through newspapers and pamphlets, denouncing the perversity of a system that took from children their childhood, their family, and their future. Isaac and Rosa represent the most innocent victims of slavery, those who were born into a system that turned human beings into property. Through this photograph, the pain and innocence of these children became a powerful political tool, capable of moving hearts and consciences. In 1882, in the Paraíba Valley, enslaved workers spread coffee beans under the blazing sun. The photograph, of rare sharpness, shows the repetitive daily life of the estates: rows of workers with shovels in hand, the strong smell of the drying grounds, the rhythmic sound of orders and labor. coffee, the emblematic product of the Brazilian economy, depended completely on enslaved labor to sustain itself. Each sack exported carried with it the sweat and suffering of hundreds of men and women. In the slave quarters at night, the body rested, but the soul remained restless. Abolition would come a few years later, but without compensation, without land, without reparation. In Bahia in 1860, a black woman carries a white child on her back. The scene, common in the manor houses of slaveholding Brazil, reveals one of the most perverse dimensions of slavery: forced and denied motherhood. Many wet nurses and caretakers were torn from their families to breastfeed and raise the master's children. The image, seemingly sweet, is a portrait of violence disguised as affection, a bond built on inequality and pain. While the black woman offered love and care, her own children grew up far away, often sold or abandoned. In Rio de Janeiro in 1875, black women sell fruit and delicacies in the streets, the famous quitandeiras, or hired-out slaves. They moved through squares and alleys with baskets balanced on their heads, coloring the urban scene with their voices, aromas, and gestures. Some were enslaved women who handed over part of their profits to their masters. Others were freed women who supported entire families with informal work. The street was, for them, a space of survival and also of power, a territory where they could negotiate, converse, teach, and trade. The activity of the quitandeiras defied the logic of submission, creating a female, Afro-Brazilian economy amid the slaveholding system. In Salvador around 1870, enslaved domestic workers carry out tasks inside the master's houses. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, and caring for the owner's children were central functions in these women's routines. Domestic work, although far from the brutality of the fields, was equally exhausting and permeated by surveillance. These enslaved women lived under constant control, with rigid schedules and little or no autonomy. The manor house, a symbol of comfort and civilization, was also a microcosm of oppression and dependence. Separated from their families, these women sustained the daily life of the white elite, who saw their service as a natural right. In Bahia in 1860, a white lady poses with two enslaved people at her side, a man and a woman. The carefully composed portrait is a visual symbol of the hierarchy that structured imperial society. The lady, dressed in fine fabrics and adornments, occupies the center of the image, while the enslaved people with submissive postures and simple garments are positioned as part of her surroundings, as essential to the scene as they were invisible. The man may have served as a coachman or footman, the woman as a maid or wet nurse. Their distant, resigned gazes reveal the silent awareness of those who lived under total domination. The photograph of Gordon, a formerly enslaved American, became one of the most impactful images of the 19th century. After fleeing a plantation in Mississippi in 1863, Gordon reached a Union camp and allowed himself to be photographed. When he removed his shirt, he revealed a back covered with scars, marks from the whip that lashed him hundreds of times. The portrait, published under the title "The Scourged Back," ran through abolitionist newspapers, shocking the public and becoming a symbol of the brutality of slavery. The image of mute and devastating pain did more for the cause of abolition than many speeches. It translated into an image what had until then been narrated in words. In 1862, in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, the facade of the firm Birch & Corbett reveals one of the largest markets for enslaved people in the United States. Behind the building's windows and bars, men, women, and children were kept imprisoned while awaiting buyers. The slave trading house functioned as a formal institution, with accounting, catalogs, and contracts. This normalization of human trafficking demonstrates how slavery was a legitimate pillar of the economy and the law. When the Civil War began, Alexandria was occupied by Union troops, and the Birch & Corbett building became a symbol of a past the country tried to erase. Between 1855 and 1865, Frederick Douglass emerged as one of the most powerful voices of American abolitionism. Born into slavery, he escaped, learned to read, and became a writer, editor, and orator. His lectures mobilized crowds. His speeches, full of passion and reason, denounced the hypocrisy of a country that called itself free while sustaining bondage. Douglass believed that education and the spoken word were weapons against racism and ignorance. He published several autobiographies in which he described the violence he witnessed and endured, inspiring generations of activists. After winning his freedom, Frederick Douglass continued his journey as a writer, editor, and diplomat. He published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, a work that would become a global reference in testimonial literature. With funds raised from lectures across Europe, he purchased his freedom and helped others do the same. Douglass defended women's suffrage, civil rights, and racial equality until the end of his life, becoming one of the most respected figures of the 19th century. His story is a reminder that liberation does not end with the breaking of physical chains. It also requires the moral and political reconstruction of an entire society. The photograph Hoeing Rice, made in South Carolina in 1904, shows African American workers bent over flooded rice fields. The water reflects the sky and the fatigue, mirroring centuries of forced labor. Many of these workers were direct descendants of enslaved people and remained bound to the land by abusive contracts and poverty. The cultivation techniques brought from West Africa had been appropriated and profited others. Rice, a staple food and a symbol of Southern cuisine in the United States, had its roots in African knowledge, a cultural legacy turned into a source of oppression. The photograph titled "These Are the Generations of Ham" from 1895 is a disturbing portrait of the racist ideologies that shaped Western culture. The expression "generations of Ham" comes from a distorted biblical interpretation used for centuries to justify the enslavement of African peoples. According to that reading, the descendants of Ham were supposedly cursed to serve their brothers. A theological lie converted into a political argument. The image represents a scene of humiliation and exotification, reproducing stereotypes of inferiority and submission. The marriage certificate with tintypes of Augustus L. Johnson and Melinda Murphy, dated July 9, 1874, marks a moment of celebration and achievement. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, marriage between African Americans became an act of asserting freedom. For centuries, the marriages of enslaved people had no legal validity. Families were separated at the master's convenience. With the end of slavery, the right to marry and to register the union represented much more than love. It symbolized recognized humanity and restored dignity. The tintype of James Washington, made at the end of the 19th century, is a portrait of Black presence in a time of transition. Tintypes, popular and accessible, allowed newly freed African American men and women to record their own image with dignity, a simple and revolutionary gesture. In the portrait, Washington poses with a firm posture and direct gaze, challenging the racist representations of the era. For many, these photographs were the first public act of personal affirmation, proof that they existed as individuals, citizens, and subjects of their own history. Portrait of African American residents in Nicodemus, Graham County, Kansas, at the end of the 19th century. Founded by formerly enslaved people and their descendants, Nicodemus became one of the most notable examples of Black self-sufficiency in the United States. Amid the arid plains of the Midwest, entire families left the post-Civil War South in search of freedom and land of their own. They built houses of mud and wood, schools, churches, and a community press. The difficulties were immense. Extreme cold, drought, and scarce resources tested survival daily. A lithograph depicting a clergyman presiding over the marriage of two enslaved people belonging to a wealthy family in Brazil in 1839. The work was created by Thierry Frère from a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debray. This image illustrates the complex reality of slavery in Brazil, where, despite the lack of freedom, wedding ceremonies were performed, yet under the continuous control of the masters over the lives of the enslaved. In 1954, an African-American mother poses with her children on the Flanagan property in Nashville, Tennessee. The portrait was made in the same year as the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling, which declared school segregation unconstitutional. In the context of that achievement, the image becomes a silent manifesto of resistance. The woman, with a firm expression, embodies the strength of black mothers who sustained generations amid institutionalized racism. Her home, simple and modest, represents more than shelter. It is a territory of dignity and love, built on work and faith. Ambrose Douglas, a formerly enslaved man, is photographed in 1939 at the Lewis Naval Stores plantation in Brooksville, Florida, surrounded by children and grandchildren, 38 descendants in all. The portrait is more than a family scene. It is testimony to reconstruction after destruction. Ambrose represents a generation born under the weight of chains and aged under the shadow of segregation, but that nonetheless made a legacy flourish. In his serene posture and direct gaze lies the pride of one who overcame erasure. Hilliard Taylor, born enslaved in Orange County, Virginia, is photographed in Boston around 1925, already in his 80s, wearing a bank messenger's uniform. His life spanned centuries of change, from the Confederate farm to the urban environment of the industrial North. The carefully aligned uniform symbolizes more than a job. It is the emblem of dignity won. Taylor was living proof of the impossible, from human property to paid worker. In 1939, Mark Thrash, a resident of Chickamauga Park, Tennessee, is photographed at 118 years of age, claiming to have been born in 1820. His life crossed the century. He saw the birth and end of slavery, the Civil War, and segregation. His face, wrinkled by time, is a living archive of history. The photograph, captured with soft light and a distant gaze, turns him into a witness of eras. Thrash is not only a survivor, but the personification of the endurance of memory. An enslaved woman at the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters in Savannah, Georgia, in 1985. The photograph, part of a historical reenactment, represents more than a visual remembrance. It is an invocation of memory. At the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters, the presence of this woman symbolizes the contemporary attempt to restore humanity to the lives erased by slavery. Every room, utensil, and stone wall bears witness to imposed discipline, ceaseless labor, and the silent resistance of the enslaved who lived there. Portrait of a Bedouin enslaver in Saudi Arabia around 1935. By recording the proud face of a man involved in human trafficking, the photograph exposes an uncomfortable truth. Even in the mid-20th century, slavery was still a reality in certain parts of the Arab world. The subject, in traditional clothing and with a proud look, seems oblivious to the brutality his trade represents. The commerce in enslaved Africans, especially women and children, persisted as a remnant of an ancient practice, fueled by tribal networks and trans-Saharan trade routes. Sugarcane cutters in Jamaica during the post-abolition period. The photograph shows men and women bent under the sun, sickles in their hands, exhausted bodies, hardened faces. Decades after abolition, the system of forced labor had reinvented itself in the form of contract, debt, and dependency. The sugarcane plantations, once sustained by slavery, continued to be the economic heart of the island. The conditions were brutal: endless workdays, precarious housing, miserable wages. Many workers were direct descendants of the enslaved people freed in 1838, who dreamed of land and freedom but found new economic chains. A group of enslaved African Americans parading in England around 1900. The scene, part of a staged protest, features men and women dressed in white, handcuffed, walking slowly before a perplexed European crowd. In the background, a poster reads, Cromwell Crusades. Help free the enslaved of cocoa. It was a theatrical denunciation of forced labor on African cocoa-producing colonies, especially on plantations in West Africa. The staging shocked by its symbolic force. Black bodies reenacting the suffering that the British public preferred to ignore while consuming chocolate, coffee, and sugar. Engraving representing the Emancipation Proclamation dated to the 19th century. Men, women, and children gather around a man who holds a clock. Time here is the protagonist. The engraving captures the symbolic instant when freedom, once dream and rumor, becomes decree. The artist depicts collective tension, eyes turned to the future, hands raised in prayer, bodies still marked by servitude. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, signed by Abraham Lincoln, was a political and moral milestone, but also an incomplete beginning. Booker T. Washington, 1887. In his portrait, the founder of the Tuskegee Institute looks directly at the camera with the expression of someone who understood the complexity of his time. Born enslaved, Washington built an educational institution that would train thousands of freed black people and their descendants. His philosophy was simple and profound. Freedom would only be complete when sustained by work, instruction, and discipline. He believed in technical education as a path to advancement and economic autonomy. Robert de Baptiste, end of the 19th century. Little remembered by books, Robert de Baptiste was one of many community leaders who kept alive the flame of black citizenship during a period of violent setbacks. A Baptist pastor, editor, and activist, he organized congregations, newspapers, and local movements that fought lynching and political silencing. In an era marked by the rise of Jim Crow laws, his voice echoed as moral and spiritual resistance. De Baptiste represents a generation of intellectuals and leaders who prepared the ground for the civil rights movement of the 20th century, keeping faith in equality alive when the state failed to guarantee it. Newell Houston Ensley, African-American educator and theologian. At a time when literacy was still a recent privilege for many freed black people, Ensley preached the transformative power of reading. To him, knowing how to read and write was more than a skill. It was the key to spiritual and social autonomy. Ensley founded schools and libraries, wrote sermons, and trained teachers, believing that knowledge was the foundation of freedom. In his classes and sermons, he united the Bible and grammar, faith and science, showing that education was also an act of faith in black humanity. Enslaved people carrying their masters in Madagascar, 19th century. The image shows black men supporting litters in which Europeans or local aristocrats rest under the tropical sun. The scene is one of silent brutality, the comfort of a few literally supported by the physical effort of others. The bodies of the carriers, tense and bent, reveal the absolute hierarchy of the era. This practice, common in French colonies and African kingdoms, shows how slavery was not a phenomenon isolated to the Atlantic, but part of a global web of exploitation. Slave cabins in Chatham County, 1934. The black and white photograph shows a row of ruined wooden cabins, some still inhabited by descendants of enslaved people. The crooked roofs and cracked walls tell stories that silence tried to erase. Inside these spaces, families resisted, loved, and transmitted culture. Even after abolition, poverty and neglect transformed the former slave quarters into permanent housing, testimony to a precarious freedom. Geechee women pounding rice on Sapelo Island, Georgia, 1925. The rhythmic sound of pestles echoes like an ancestral beat brought from West Africa. The Geechee women, descendants of enslaved Africans on the Sea Islands, preserved language, cuisine, and agricultural traditions over the centuries. By pounding rice, they perpetuate ancient knowledge that survived the crossing and slavery. The photograph captures this moment of continuity. The body in motion, the inherited gesture, the collective rhythm.